The chill of Atlanta November hit Eleanor Vance in the face as the heavy door of the Sterling plate slammed shut behind her. Just seconds ago, she had been standing inside, where the warm yellow light and the hum of conversation promised a pleasant dinner. Now, she was alone on the cobblestone sidewalk of upscale Buckhead, the restaurant manager's gentle but firm push still imprinted on her arm through her dress. Sarah Jenkins, the manager, stood in the doorway in a tailored charcoal black uniform. She folded her arms across her chest, her pretty but cold face showing no sign of displeasure. Her voice, though trying to remain professional, was laced with unmistakable condescension. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for the few customers waiting nearby or just getting out of their cars to hear, "Like I said, we don't have any tables available at this hour. Furthermore, your attire may not be entirely appropriate for the formal atmosphere of our restaurant." Eleanor glanced down at her outfit, a simple but well-tailored navy business dress, a beige blazer, and smart low heels. Nothing sloppy or inappropriate. It was the kind of outfit a teacher, an office worker, a regular person would wear after a day of work for a nice dinner. But clearly, in Sarah Jenkins's eyes, it was not classy enough. She hadn't even bothered to ask her name, hadn't even checked to see if she had made a reservation, which Eleanor knew she had done under the name Vance. Sarah's eyes had scanned her from head to toe the moment she entered, and the decision had been made almost instantly. A few curious glances turned toward Eleanor. An older couple looked concerned but quickly looked away. A group of stylishly dressed young people whispered and giggled. No one spoke up. No one asked questions. The door opened again, swallowing a few more well-dressed guests, then closed, leaving Eleanor with the noise of Peachtree traffic and the chill of more than just the night wind. She stood still for a second, not in shock or confusion, but to take in the moment. The initial shock quickly faded, replaced by a heavy silence, a cold determination in her dark brown eyes as she stared at the polished wooden door that had just denied her. She adjusted her coat, took a deep breath of the cold air, then calmly turned and walked away. She didn't go far. Just a few dozen yards to a corner hidden by an old oak tree where the streetlights didn't reach far. She stopped, leaned against the rough brick wall, and pulled out a cheap, old-fashioned cell phone from her bag. A perfect addition to her Eleanor Vance cover. Slender, well-groomed fingers quickly dialed a series of numbers she knew by heart. The other end picked up almost immediately. "Chen here." The voice of the woman standing in the shadows was different now. Gone was the timidity or false embarrassment of Eleanor Vance. Instead, it was the sharp, cold, unmistakable authority of Isabel Moreau, CEO of Apex Hospitality Group, which owns the national chain of upscale restaurants, the Sterling Plate. "Mark, it's me," Isabel said, her voice even but carrying considerable weight. "Buckhead branch, serious incident, manager Sarah Jenkins." She glanced at the clock on her phone. "Note the time, 7:15 p.m., November 12th. I was refused service and asked to leave the restaurant." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Mark Chen's voice came through, tense and angry. "What? She dares? Isabel, are you okay? I'm calling security." "No," Isabel interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm perfectly fine, but don't do anything. Absolutely no contact with the Atlanta branch or anyone involved right now. I don't want to raise any alarm. I want to observe a little more. Just let things play out naturally." "But, Isabel—" "I know what I'm doing, Mark," Isabel said, her tone provoking no argument. "This is exactly the kind of problem I feared might be brewing in our system. I've experienced it firsthand now. Wait for my next instructions." She ended the call, and the screen went black, returning the corner to darkness. Isabel Moreau stood there for a moment, letting her initial anger subside, giving way to steely determination. Sarah Jenkins had made a terrible mistake. Not by insulting an ordinary black woman, but by inadvertently angering the head of the empire she worked for, and Isabel Moreau was not one to let it go. Isabel didn't return to the luxury hotel where she was supposed to stay as CEO. Instead, she walked a few blocks to find a small, cozy, not-too-crowded coffee shop. She chose a table in a corner, ordered a cup of hot chamomile tea, and opened an old paperback. Another Eleanor Vance prop. On the outside, she looked like any other middle-aged woman looking for some peace and quiet after a long day. On the inside, the brain of a seasoned executive was running at full speed. About 20 minutes later, Mark Chen walked into the cafe. He was about 45 years old, tall, and dressed in a neat business suit, but his face showed worry and anger when he saw Isabel. He pulled up a chair opposite her and lowered his voice. "Isabel?" "What the hell happened?" Mark asked, trying to control his voice. "I can't believe Jenkins would—" Isabel sipped her tea, setting the cup down carefully. She recounted the incident briefly and precisely, focusing on Sarah Jenkins's actions and words, without adding personal emotion. "She didn't ask my name, didn't check the reservation list, even though I was sure I had made a reservation. She just looked me up and down, assessed my attire, and decided I was inappropriate. The real reason was obvious, Mark. In her eyes, a modestly dressed black woman did not belong in a place as elegant as the Sterling Plate." Outrage was written all over Mark's face. "Unacceptable in one of our flagship restaurants. We must fire her immediately. This is a blatant violation of Apex's anti-discrimination policy." Isabel shook her head slightly. "Firing her would be the easiest thing to do, Mark. And believe me, I'd love to do it right now. But is this a Sarah Jenkins problem or a symptom of a larger malady lurking in the culture of this branch? Maybe even the Southeast region? I need to get to the bottom of it." She paused, looking Mark straight in the eye. "You know, I've heard some whispers, some unofficial reports of questionable service at this Buckhead branch over the past few months. Vague complaints about arrogance, unfriendliness. That's the main reason I decided to make this undercover trip. I wanted to see for myself the quality of service, and more importantly, the staff's true attitude toward all types of customers, not just those who looked rich or famous." Isabel's plan was clearer now. The Sarah Jenkins incident was not just a personal affront, but also an opportunity to expose a deeper underlying problem. "I wouldn't act hastily," she continued. "First, I want to see if anyone else on staff there knew about Jenkins's behavior and tolerated it. I want to review recent reports from Robert Miller, the regional manager, about the branch. Had he missed any warning signs? And I want to review the customer complaint history in more detail." The next day, Isabel and Mark set up a temporary command center in a suite at another hotel, far from Buckhead. They needed privacy and secure access to Apex Hospitality Group's internal systems. Mark, with his COO credentials, easily retrieved the necessary data. They started with Sarah Jenkins's personnel file. On the surface, it was impressive. She had worked for Apex for 5 years, rising quickly from assistant manager to restaurant manager. The Buckhead branch's sales and profit figures had been consistently good under her management. But in her annual performance reviews, there were vague notes from Robert Miller's predecessor and from Robert himself. Needs improvement in communication skills with subordinates. Sometimes shows impatience in high-pressure situations. There were no formal complaints of racism or unfair treatment of customers. This could mean that nothing happened, or that the complaints were hushed up at the branch level, or that customers didn't want to be bothered and didn't report them to higher-ups. Next, they analyzed customer complaint data from the Buckhead branch over the past 6 months. There were about a dozen complaints logged through the restaurant's online feedback system and comment cards. Several were about long wait times, one about food not being hot enough. 3 were more notable, referring to the arrogant, nasty, or unfriendly attitude of the blonde manager. However, none of them specifically mentioned race or described the circumstances. These general complaints were easily dismissed or explained away as difficult customers. Then they looked at the monthly reports that Robert Miller, the Southeast Regional Director, sent back to headquarters in New York. As Isabel suspected, the reports focused primarily on financial metrics: revenue, profits, operating expenses, occupancy rates. The management and staff reviews were sketchy, often just general comments like stable operations, efficient staff. There was no mention of issues with work culture, employee morale, or potential signs of poor service. Robert Miller seemed to care only about the numbers on paper. Finally, Mark discreetly requested that the corporation's security department extract all security camera data from the entrance and lobby area of the Sterling Plate restaurant in Buckhead on Friday night, November 12th, between 7 and 8 p.m. The reason given was to check security procedures and ensure image quality periodically. This tape would be the most important evidence. While waiting for the tape, Isabel decided she needed more information from the inside. She didn't want to get involved, but she needed an objective look at the work environment. She instructed Mark to contact Laura Evans, the head of human resources at headquarters. "Laura," Mark said over the phone, trying to sound casual, "we're planning some advanced training for the Southeast region later this year. To better prepare, could you send a junior HR professional to the Buckhead branch to do a quick morale assessment? Just talk privately with a few employees in different positions: servers, bartenders, front desk. Find out how they feel about the work environment, about management, what challenges they face. Completely confidential, of course." Laura Evans, a professional and efficient middle-aged woman, didn't ask much. She agreed and promised to send someone out the next day and send a summary report to Mark within 48 hours. 2 days later, the HR executive's report arrived. It was fairly neutral, noting that most employees were happy with their jobs, but there were some concerns. Of particular note was an interview with a young male server named David. Initially, David was quite reserved, but when asked about his relationship with his manager and his handling of customers, he hesitantly said that Manager Jenkins was sometimes very demanding and seemed to favor customers who looked rich or powerful. He also hinted that Mrs. Jenkins occasionally made unflattering comments about the appearance or dress of customers she deemed unworthy of the restaurant, and that this made some employees feel uncomfortable. David did not directly mention the Eleanor Vance incident, perhaps out of fear or uncertainty, but his hints provided an important piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, security had sent over the requested video. Isabel and Mark watched it in silence. The quality was good. It had all happened exactly as Isabel remembered. A camera mounted on the ceiling near the door had captured her clearly as Eleanor Vance entered the restaurant. Sarah Jenkins approaching, looking at her appraisingly. The brief conversation, though the audio was muted, Sarah's body language, the crossed arms, the cool expression, the slight tilt of her chin, said it all. And finally, the gentle but firm push she made out the door. There was no doubt about it. Isabel leaned back in her chair, her eyes on the screen lingering on Sarah Jenkins, turning and walking back into the restaurant after the door closed. "Enough," she said quietly. "We have enough evidence. It's time to act." With undeniable security footage, reports from HR professionals documenting David's concerns and innuendos, personnel records showing overlooked warning signs, and inadequate reporting by Regional Director Robert Miller, Isabel Moreau has a complete picture. The problem lies not just in Sarah Jenkins's racist behavior, but also in a lack of oversight from superiors and a hidden corporate culture where such behavior can go undetected or be tolerated. She decided that the confrontation had to take place where the company's power and values were most evident. Apex Hospitality Group's New York headquarters. She wanted Sarah Jenkins and her direct supervisor, Robert Miller, to confront her with the truth, right at the heart of the company. Laura Evans, the head of human resources, also needed to be present to ensure that everything was done correctly and to be involved in planning the next steps. Isabel picked up the intercom and called her executive assistant. "Linda, I need you to schedule an emergency meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. in Executive Boardroom 1, she ordered, her voice calm but firm. Attendees, myself, Mark Chen, Laura Evans, Robert Miller from the Southeast region, and Sarah Jenkins, Buckhead branch manager. Subject: discuss Southeast region strategy and performance. Make sure that airfare and all other necessary arrangements are made for Mr. Miller and Ms. Jenkins immediately. This is a mandatory meeting." Linda, a veteran and discreet assistant, asked no further questions. She knew when her CEO was serious. Within an hour, everything was arranged. The meeting notice was sent out with a completely normal appearance, leaving no doubt as to its true purpose. That night, Isabel did not work late as usual. She returned to her luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, a world away from the dark Atlanta street where Eleanor Vance had been rejected a few days earlier. She poured herself a glass of red wine and stood by the large windows, looking out at the city lights. Memories flooded back. It wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination. As a young black woman, fresh out of business school, trying to break into the white male-dominated world of finance and hospitality, she'd experienced the looks, the innuendos, the doors slammed in her face because of her skin color and gender. It was those bitter experiences that forged Isabel Moreau into a strong, resilient, and determined woman who would build a company where talent and hard work were valued above all else, where respect and fairness were an unshakable foundation. She has built Apex Hospitality Group on 3 core values: respect, integrity, excellence. These values are engraved on the walls of every office, every restaurant, and are reiterated in every employee training session. Sarah Jenkins's actions are not only a personal insult to her, but also a blatant trampling on the very principles she has worked so hard to build. The initial anger had cooled, replaced by a cold determination to do the right thing, not for revenge, but to stand up for what she believed in, to send a clear message that discrimination of any kind had no place at Apex. Firing Sarah Jenkins was necessary, but not enough. There had to be an acknowledgement of responsibility from higher management. Systemic changes had to be made to prevent similar incidents from happening again. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman in the window was no longer the plain, vulnerable Eleanor Vance. She was Isabel Moreau, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, a respected leader in her industry. Tomorrow, Sarah Jenkins and Robert Miller would face this woman in all her power and determination. Isabel put down her glass. She walked to her desk and reviewed the files Mark had neatly arranged. The personnel file printout, the customer complaint report, Robert Miller's report, the HR interview notes, and a USB drive containing the security footage. Everything was ready. Tomorrow's confrontation wouldn't be easy, but it had to happen. Justice had to be served, not just for her, but for the image and future of Apex Hospitality Group. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Executive Boardroom Number 1 on the 50th floor of the Apex Tower in Manhattan was ready. The spacious room, with its long, polished wooden table, fine leather chairs, and sweeping views of the New York skyline through its floor-to-ceiling windows, exuded power and luxury. Sarah Jenkins and Robert Miller were there. Sarah was wearing an expensive black business suit, trying to appear calm and professional, but her slightly shaking hands and her eyes darting around the room betrayed her inner anxiety. She still didn't understand why she had been suddenly summoned to New York for what seemed to be a general strategy meeting. Robert Miller, the regional director, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a somewhat bureaucratic look, sat next to Sarah, flipping through a file indifferently. He seemed more confident, thinking this was just a regular high-level performance review meeting. Laura Evans, the head of human resources, was already sitting at the opposite end of the table, her face serious and unreadable. Mark Chen stood by the window, watching silently. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Isabel Moreau walked in. There was no trace of the plain Eleanor Vance. Today, she was the embodiment of power. She wore a perfectly tailored cobalt blue suit that accentuated her shapely figure. Her dark hair was elegantly styled, and her makeup was light but sharp. Her demeanor exuded confidence, authority, and a certain calm. Sarah Jenkins and Robert Miller reflexively stood up when the CEO entered. Isabel nodded to them professionally, not holding Sarah's gaze for too long, then sat down in the chair at the head of the table. "Good morning, everyone," Isabel began, her voice calm and clear, echoing in the quiet room. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I'd like to begin by hearing from Mr. Miller a quick report on the Southeast region's overall performance for the past quarter, with particular attention to the key metrics for the Buckhead branch." Robert Miller, seemingly relieved that the meeting had started as expected, quickly opened the document and presented the numbers. Revenues were growing steadily, profits were exceeding targets, and expenses were well controlled. He did not forget to praise Sarah Jenkins for effectively managing the flagship branch. Sarah sat up a little straighter, her initial tension seeming to dissipate somewhat. Isabel listened attentively, nodding occasionally, showing no emotion. When Robert finished his report, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Miller. Those numbers are very encouraging." Then, her tone suddenly changed, becoming sharper, more focused. "However, today I would like to discuss in more depth another aspect of our business, one that cannot be measured by those numbers, but is extremely important to the reputation and core values of Apex Hospitality Group. That is the quality of our service and our attitude towards our guests." She paused for a second, her eyes moving from Robert Miller to Sarah Jenkins. "I want to talk about a specific incident that occurred at the Buckhead branch last Friday evening, November 12th, at approximately 7:15 p.m. The atmosphere in the conference room immediately became tense. Robert Miller frowned and looked at Sarah questioningly. Sarah swallowed, trying to keep her face calm, but her cheeks began to turn red. Isabel looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Jenkins, could you describe to me the restaurant's standard procedure for handling a busy situation and a guest arriving who you consider inappropriately dressed or without a reservation?" Sarah, clearly taken aback by this particular question, took a deep breath. "CEO," she began, her voice shaking slightly but trying to sound professional. "Our procedure is to check the availability of tables and reservations. If the restaurant is truly full, we will politely inform the guest and suggest that they return at another time or suggest other Apex locations nearby. As for the dress code, we have a formal evening dress code. If the guest's attire is truly inappropriate, we will tactfully explain and may refuse service to ensure the overall atmosphere of the restaurant." "Very methodical," Isabel remarked, her voice steady. "So, using that procedure last Friday night around 7:15, do you recall refusing service to a black woman about 50, wearing a navy business dress and a beige jacket? Did you tell her the restaurant was full and that her attire was inappropriate and then asked her to leave?" Sarah Jenkins paled. She stammered, I'm not sure. It was a busy night, CEO. There were a lot of people coming and going. Could there have been some mistake? I don't remember a specific instance like that." She glanced at Robert Miller for help, but he was looking at her with a serious expression. Isabel Moreau's lips twitched slightly, a cold smile playing across her lips. "Oh, there's no mistake, Miss Jenkins." She leaned forward, her voice no longer steady but sharp, each word clear. "Because the black woman you kicked out of the restaurant that night was me." Absolute silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, Sarah Jenkins gasped, her eyes wide with horror, her face as white as a sheet. She stared at Isabel, unable to speak. All her confident, professional demeanor had evaporated in an instant, replaced by a look of utter panic. Robert Miller was equally shocked. He turned to look at Sarah, his eyes filled with disbelief and anger. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Laura Evans sighed softly, her eyes showing disappointment but not surprise. She must have guessed what was going on when Mark Chen asked for a report on morale in Buckhead. Isabel let the silence linger for a few more seconds, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. Then she continued, her voice cold but powerful. "That's right. I visited the Buckhead branch as a regular customer under a different name, Eleanor Vance, to experience for myself the quality of service we so proudly promote. I wanted to see Apex Hospitality Group through the eyes of a regular customer, not through rosy reports or pre-announced visits." She paused, looking directly into Sarah Jenkins's tear-filled eyes. "And what I got that night, Miss Jenkins, was not the excellent service or the respect we promise. What I got was blatant discrimination, based on skin color and superficial prejudices about appearance. You judged me, convicted me, and dismissed me for no reason other than the prejudices in your own head." Isabel gestured to Mark Chen. He quietly walked over to the projector that had been set up and plugged the USB into his computer. The large screen at the back of the conference room lit up, showing a short video clip from the security camera. The room watched, with bated breath. The tape had no sound, but the images were clear. It showed Eleanor Vance entering, Sarah Jenkins approaching, a brief conversation with Sarah's patronizing body language, and finally Sarah placing her hand on Eleanor's arm, gently pushing her out the door. The tape ended with Sarah turning and walking back inside, her face cold. "As you can see," Isabel said as the tape ended, "there was no mistake here." She turned to Laura Evans. "Miss Evans, can you summarize the main points of the HR specialist's report about the conversation with employee David at the Buckhead branch? Without naming any specific people?" Laura Evans opened her file. "CEO, the report notes that a young server expressed discomfort with management, sometimes being critical and preferring to customers who looked wealthy. The employee also alluded to management making negative comments about the appearance or dress of customers who were deemed unfit, and that this created an unpleasant work environment for some." Isabel nodded. "That suggests this wasn't a spontaneous act, Miss Jenkins. This is a pattern of behavior that may have been going on for a long time." Then she turned to Robert Miller, who was still sitting there dumbfounded. "And Mr. Miller, can you explain why these signs, these customer complaints about arrogance, these notes in the personnel file, these insinuations from employees, why are none of these things reflected in your monthly reports to headquarters? Why is your oversight so focused on the numbers and completely ignoring the core issues of culture and service at such an important branch?" Robert Miller stammered. I'm sorry, CEO Moreau. I was too focused on the financials. I trusted Ms. Jenkins's report. I admit there was a serious lapse in my oversight. I take full responsibility for this." All eyes were now on Sarah Jenkins. Faced with the undeniable video evidence, the employee's second-hand testimony, the superior's admission of shortcomings, and especially the true identity of the person she had offended, Sarah was completely devastated. She burst into tears, tears streaming down her pale face. "CEO Moreau, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She choked, her voice breaking between sobs. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I really didn't know it was you. If I had known—" "What if you knew it was me, Ms. Jenkins?" Isabel interrupted, her voice icy. "Would you roll out the red carpet and treat me like a queen? The problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is that you treated a customer, any customer, in a way that was unfair and prejudiced because of the color of their skin and the way they looked. That's unforgivable." No, it's not like that. Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I didn't mean to be racist. Really, I didn't. It's just that she looked different from our regular customers. I was so stressed because the restaurant was crowded. I made a bad decision in the heat of the moment. She tried to come up with an excuse, but the words were becoming more and more meaningless. Then she turned to pleading. Please, CEO Moreau, please forgive me this time. I promise I'll never do it again. Please don't fire me. I have a family to take care of. I have 2 small children. This job means everything to me. Please give me a chance. Sarah almost knelt down beside the conference table, but Mark Chen stopped her with a stern look. The confrontation had reached its climax. The evidence had been presented. The truth had been revealed. The confession, albeit belated and calculated, had been made. Now it was time for judgment. Isabel Moreau let Sarah Jenkins's sobs and pleas echo in the conference room for a few more seconds. She showed no emotion or waver. Her gaze remained cold and unwavering. When Sarah seemed a little exhausted, Isabel spoke, her voice clear and decisive, cutting through the chaos. Miss Jenkins, she said, your belated remorse, however sincere it may seem at this point, does not change the nature of your actions that night. And as I said, the core issue is not that you failed to recognize me as the CEO. The issue is that you acted based on racial prejudice and superficial judgment toward a customer. Any customer. That is a betrayal of the core values that Apex Hospitality Group was built on and is committed to upholding. That is unacceptable. She paused, looking directly at Sarah. Firing you immediately would be the easiest decision, and probably the one most people would expect. Your behavior deserves that punishment. Sarah closed her eyes, waiting for the worst. Robert Miller held his breath, too. However, Isabel continued, causing Sarah to open her eyes in surprise. Apex also believes in giving people the chance to correct their mistakes and learn from them, if, and only if, there is a real commitment to change and a clear plan of action. That change requires more than tears and apologies when caught. She turned to Laura Evans. Ms. Evans, has Human Resources prepared the company's procedures for dealing with serious violations of the anti-discrimination policy? Laura nodded. Yes, CEO. We have reviewed Ms. Jenkins's record and the seriousness of the incident. We are recommending a number of disciplinary and corrective actions. Isabel turned back to Sarah. Miss Jenkins, this is my decision. You will be suspended immediately, without pay, for 3 months, effective today. This time is for you to seriously reflect on your actions and the prejudices that led to them. Sarah was stunned, but at least it wasn't a dismissal. Isabel continued, her voice uncompromising. After your 3-month suspension, if you wish to continue working at Apex, you will be required to participate in a special probationary program lasting exactly 1 year. This program is not a favor, but a mandatory requirement and will be designed and closely monitored by Human Resources in conjunction with an independent diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) consultant appointed by us. She further explained, this program will include intensive and mandatory training in unconscious bias awareness, anti-racism, intercultural communication skills, and inclusive leadership skills. You will also be required to attend regular individual counseling sessions with a DEI specialist. Additionally, you may be required to participate in community service projects or activities to expand your understanding and empathy. During this year, your progress, attitude, and behavior will be rigorously evaluated quarterly by HR and your consultant. Any indication of lack of cooperation, hostility, or any other inappropriate behavior, no matter how minor, will result in immediate and permanent termination, with no second chances. Isabel looked Sarah straight in the eye. This is the only way you can keep your job at Apex. It won't be easy. It will require absolute commitment and real change on your part. Do you accept these terms? Sarah Jenkins, her face still streaked with tears, now had a glimmer of hope, albeit one that came with harsh punishment and trial. She knew she had no choice. Being fired for racial discrimination would be an indelible mark on her career. She nodded vigorously. I accept, CEO. I accept all the terms. I will do anything you ask. I will prove that I can change. Good, Isabel said. Mrs. Evans will work with you on the necessary paperwork right after this meeting. She handed Laura a prepared memorandum. Isabel then turned to Robert Miller, who had been sitting silently, his face still tense. Mr. Miller, this incident is a serious wake-up call. It shows a serious flaw not only in your individual conduct, but also in your oversight, reporting, and maintenance of your corporate culture in the Southeast region. Her tone hardened. I am holding you, as regional director, directly accountable for correcting this situation. I want you to work closely with Ms. Evans and the Human Resources Department to conduct a complete review of the performance evaluation process for your regional managers. This process must include assessing soft skills, attitudes toward employees and customers, and commitment to Apex's core values, not just financial metrics. She continued her assignment. I also want you to review and improve the mechanism for receiving, processing, and reporting feedback and complaints from both employees and customers in a more efficient and transparent manner. Make sure that every voice is heard and every issue is resolved promptly, not swept under the rug or ignored. I need a detailed, concrete action plan with clear timelines on my desk within the next 30 days. Robert Miller nodded emphatically. Yes, CEO, I understand. I will do it immediately. He knew that his job was also at stake if he did not demonstrate positive change. Finally, Isabel turned to Laura Evans. Ms. Evans, the Human Resources Department's responsibility is critical to shaping and sustaining our corporate culture. I want you, starting next quarter, to develop and implement a comprehensive mandatory training program on anti-discrimination, identifying and addressing unconscious bias, and building a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion for all levels of management, from supervisors on up, across the entire Apex Hospitality Group. No exceptions. At the same time, she stressed, let's review and strengthen our anonymous reporting channels. Make sure that every employee at any level feels absolutely safe and protected when they want to speak up about misconduct, unethical behavior, or violations of company policy that they witness. Laura Evans took careful notes. Roger that, CEO. We'll get to work right away. Isabel Moreau looked around the conference room. I want everyone to understand this, she said, her voice full of authority. What happened at the Buckhead location was not just the fault of one person. It is a painful reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must work tirelessly to protect and uphold the values we stand for. Apex Hospitality Group serves everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or any other characteristic. We must treat every guest and every colleague with the respect and dignity they deserve. No exceptions. This message must be clearly communicated and enforced throughout the organization. The meeting ended in a solemn and somewhat heavy atmosphere, but also with a hidden determination to change. Sarah Jenkins was escorted out of the room by Laura Evans to sign the necessary documents, still looking panicked but resigned to her fate. Robert Miller stayed for a while, continuing to express his apologies and pledges of action. Isabel Moreau and Mark Chen were the last to leave the conference room. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with both relief and admiration. You handled it well, Isabel. Strict but fair. Isabel nodded slightly, looking out the window. Justice isn't enough, Mark. We need to make real change. This is just the first step. 6 months have passed since the tense standoff at Apex Hospitality Group headquarters. The decisions made that day sent ripples throughout the company. Sarah Jenkins is in the middle of her year-long probation. Her 3-month unpaid suspension has been a huge financial and emotional blow to her. She now has to regularly attend mandatory DEI training, individual counseling sessions with a tough but fair psychologist, and even volunteer work at a community center in a diverse Atlanta neighborhood, an experience that was foreign and initially uncomfortable for her. Quarterly reports from HR and her counselor show that Sarah is cooperating, albeit reluctantly at first. She is being forced to confront her own deeply held biases, learn to listen to different perspectives, and re-examine her own behavior. There is no guarantee that she will completely change or make it through the year, but at least she is participating, doing what is required. Her future at Apex remains up in the air, depending entirely on actual progress over the next 12 months. At the Sterling Plate in Buckhead, an experienced interim manager was brought in. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Employees, including David, the young waiter who had hinted at Sarah's behavior, felt the work environment was less tense, more open, and more fair. David was even promoted to shift supervisor after demonstrating competence and integrity. Customer service and welcome procedures were reviewed, emphasizing respect and equality for all. While sales may not have skyrocketed as they did when Sarah Jenkins focused on VIP customers, satisfaction among both employees and the majority of customers seems to have improved. Across Apex Hospitality Group, the mandatory DEI training program developed by Laura Evans and her team is being rolled out aggressively. Workshops, online courses, and group discussions are being held regularly for all levels of management. There was some initial skepticism or quiet resistance, but the firm message from CEO Isabel Moreau and senior leadership has made it clear that this is not a one-time initiative, but a long-term commitment. The anonymous reporting channel has also been promoted more widely, and reports of culture-related issues, while small, have begun to emerge, indicating that employees feel safer speaking up. Robert Miller, the Southeast Regional Director, has demonstrated a marked change in his management style. He is spending more time visiting branches, speaking directly with employees at all levels, and taking the initiative to learn about issues beyond financial numbers. The detailed action plan he submitted to Isabel to improve supervision and feedback processes was viewed as serious and promising. He knows he has been given a second chance, and is working hard to prove himself worthy of that trust. In her spacious New York office, Isabel Moreau reads monthly updates on Sarah Jenkins's progress, the progress of DEI training, and changes in the Southeast region. She doesn't feel gloating or complacent. Instead, there's a heavy but necessary sense of responsibility. Justice, Apex's way, has been served, not just by punishing the guilty party, but by trying to create opportunities for redress and, more importantly, by making systemic changes to prevent a recurrence. She recalls feeling cold and angry as she stood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling Plate that night. The incident was a painful reminder that the fight against prejudice, discrimination, and injustice is still a long and challenging journey, even within the organization she worked so hard to build. It requires constant vigilance, the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and decisive action to defend core values. But that day, and in the days that followed, she acted. She used her power not for personal vengeance, but to demand justice, to strengthen the company's moral foundation, and to send an unmistakable message. At Apex Hospitality Group, human dignity and fairness are non-negotiable. Isabel Moreau stood up and looked out at the slowly lit Manhattan skyline. The satisfaction came not from seeing Sarah Jenkins pay the price, but from knowing that a serious problem had been identified, confronted, and resolved in a thorough, systematic way. Justice had been served, not just through punishment, but through a commitment to change. She returned to her desk, turned on her computer, and continued steering Apex Hospitality Group forward, with a new, stronger determination to build a future where every individual, employee, and guest was treated with the respect and fairness they deserved. That was the true legacy she wanted to leave. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.